everybody, welcome back. You'll notice that we are not shooting this on the same day that we filmed the last couple of videos about divorce. I'm going to tell you why at the end of this segment. But what we're going to try to do right now is answer the last remaining questions that came in during this You Ask, We Answer sermon series on divorce. So, getting right at it, the first question that came in, when people were talking about divorce, part of the discussion was about adultery. This is really a question about sexual fidelity more than divorce, but somebody asked the question, what constitutes or what counts as adultery? Guys?
I think the quick answer is sexual activity between a married and a non-married person would be adultery. So if a person is married and they're having sexual relations with someone outside of the marriage, that constitutes an act of adultery. Especially as it pertains to our topic of divorce.
Okay. Anybody want to add anything?
Just that, Jesus going through this list of commandments in the Sermon on the Mount talks about not only a specific sexual act with someone, but also viewing someone lustfully is adultery. It's not like adultery. It's not leading towards adultery. It is, you have committed adultery with someone in your heart. So still a sexual act, but a non-physical sexual act is still considered adultery in the light of Scripture. Yeah.
I'm going to assume that this question was asked this way because the person who asked this question was trying to get at the essence of Matthew chapter 19 when Jesus says, if you divorce for any other reason other than sexual infidelity, you're already guilty, and you make somebody else, if you remarry, the implication is you make somebody else guilty of the act of adultery. But next question. How long should you stay married if there's no love, no trust, no respect, and one spouse is not attempting or will not attempt counseling? Anybody?
Well, how long? Jesus says, what God has joined together, let no man separate. So I think the how long question is until death do us part. We've made a vow, we've made a covenant relationship with one another. So how long, we're not given grounds for divorce in this sort of example. I think that it makes for a very tough marriage, and it becomes very difficult, and not to make it trivial or belittling it at all. And that is a very difficult family and marriage relationship to live in if your spouse is not loving and trusting in this. But the how long, we're not given an opportunity to abandon. I think one of the things that we've talked about in the previous videos is the idea that there's always the hope for restoration. And so even though things are not going well now, and they're not willing to respond to counseling now, doesn't mean that God isn't able to work in their heart and change their heart to do something in the future. So all things are terrible and bad now based off this description. How long should you stay in a marriage? You should stay in a marriage until death do us part. I think it's a biblical approach.
Okay. Anybody else?
I always feel, with so many of these questions, I feel like my first response to all of them is I'm sorry. Because that sounds terrible. And I hate that you would have to ask that question. But I would point back to something that I think you said in one of the earlier sermons, that marriage isn't necessarily primarily for your happiness, but it's for your holiness. And when we start viewing things that make us unhappy as things we need to separate from, we miss out on a lot of blessing from God that can happen through suffering and trial. And so while it's tough to say you remain and you fight for restoration, that seems to be the clear answer from Scripture.
Okay. All right, next question. My husband hasn't provided for his family in over a year. He is verbally and emotionally abusive, occasionally physically. He manipulates ... The question just broke off there, and I think it's because our server didn't allow you to add the rest of the paragraph that you were probably going to say here. And I assume that what you're going to ask, this is an assumption, are those things grounds for divorce? So, guys, based on this question, verbally, emotionally abusive, occasionally physically abusive, neglects his family, is that grounds for divorce?
Y'all know I'm of the opinion that physically abusive is grounds for divorce, but really the question here shouldn't be, can I get a divorce? It's, should I get a divorce? So if the question is, should I've got to say no. I think that you should exit the situation. You should make sure that you and your children are safe. But divorce is a nuclear option. Exit the situation, work on it from the outside, but if you can withstand getting a divorce, don't do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would agree with what you just heard, with the exception that what I think sometimes we typically do is we go immediately to divorce. Mm-hmm. And where Scripture doesn't give perhaps the biblical grounds for divorce, and I'm not sure. I think I may disagree with Joshua on this, and it's okay that not all pastors will agree on what is biblical grounds for divorce and what isn't. I would say I absolutely would be adamant, do not stay in that home. So separate, but perhaps don't divorce. And maybe you separate permanently, which means you may never be able to legally remarry. You may never be able to enter into another relationship, but now you're safe. Your children are safe. You don't have to have anything to do with this husband ever again, but that does not mean that you must divorce him. I think sometimes think in extremes and say, well, if he's doing this, then I'm going to divorce. Well, there is a step before that, and that step may be temporary. If God changes your husband's heart, perhaps you should reconcile, but I wouldn't trust that because your safety is at stake, your children's safety is at stake, unless you're very confident that this is a different man. But doesn't mean that you have to divorce. Maybe you could consider separating from him for life and living the single and celibate life, though you're still legally married, not in the same house with this guy, maybe not even in the same city with this man ever again. Hey guys, thanks for sending in some great questions. We have a couple more that we want to answer, so stay tuned for this next segment.